I stood in the military courtroom at Naval Station Norfolk, and the air was so tight it felt like my uniform collar was closing around my throat. The bailiff's voice echoed against the paneled walls, commanding everyone to rise. I obeyed like the rest heels clicking against the polished floor, eyes fixed forward as the military judge entered with calm authority. Years of service had taught me how to salute and how to mask fear, but nothing prepared me for this moment. When the judge's eyes met mine, I snapped to attention and answered his question with the ritual words, "Yes, Your Honor." I had worn this uniform in war zones, on the steel decks of carriers, through nights of sandstorms in the Middle East. I had stood in front of my sailors giving orders with confidence I sometimes had to invent. But here, inside a courtroom of my own Navy, I felt stripped bare. The prosecutor's voice carried steady and sharp as he began to read the charges. Espionage, treason, unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Each word landed like a physical strike. I felt the eyes of the jury panel on me. 7 officers sat in rigid silence on the right side, their insignia gleaming, their pens scratching as they took notes on the life I had built and the life I was about to lose. I could almost hear my heart in the quiet that followed. The name Jennings had once been spoken with respect on these grounds. Now it was linked to betrayal. Then I heard the name that twisted the knife deeper than any accusation. Evelyn, my stepmother. She was being called as the first witness for the prosecution. She walked past me with that same clipped stride she used to command the kitchen table back in Fayetteville. Her perfume was familiar and suffocating. She took the oath, her hand steady as stone, and when she spoke, her voice was cold enough to frost the walls. "Laura Jennings has always defied discipline," she said. "She has never respected boundaries. I believe she is capable of betraying her country. My own stepmother, the woman who had spent years reminding me that I was never good enough, now stood before a military court to brand me a traitor." I glanced at the panel of officers. Some stared without expression. Others lowered their eyes, but none looked at me with the loyalty I had once believed my service had earned. My pulse hammered as I tried to steady my breathing. How could I defend myself when the enemy was not only the evidence, but my own family's testimony? The judge's gavel struck lightly, calling order after Evelyn's final sentence. The words she had dropped into that room spread like gasoline on open fire. I wanted to shout that I had spent 12 years protecting this nation, that I had bled in silence for the flag that hung behind the judge. Instead, I stood locked in place, forced to salute the process that was dismantling me. For the first time in my career, my fate was not in my own hands or in the mission I carried. It was in the whispers of a family that had never wanted me, and in the silence of officers trained to believe paper trails more than human truth. If your stepmother stood in a courtroom and declared that you were a traitor, what would you do? Would you bow to shame, or would you fight until the last breath to clear your name? Tell me in the comments. I grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, just outside Fort Bragg, where the sound of helicopters was as common as birdsong. My earliest memories were of a small house with peeling paint and a yard my father always kept clipped short, as if the neighbor's judgment mattered more than comfort. My mother died when I was 7, and within a year my father remarried. Evelyn came into our lives with her polished nails and perfect smile, and for a short while I thought she might bring stability. Instead, she brought a kind of discipline that had nothing to do with love. To the outside world, she was gracious. She baked pies for church potlucks, volunteered at the school fair, and called everyone sweetheart. But the moment the door shut, she became something else entirely. If I left a glass on the counter, she would grip my arm and hiss that I was lazy. If I failed to fold a towel precisely, she would slam it on the floor and order me to redo the entire load until it met her standards. My father, already weighed down by his own military service, rarely intervened. He said Evelyn kept the house in order, and I should be grateful for her guidance. I remember one evening in particular. A neighbor stopped by to borrow a cup of sugar. Evelyn opened the door with her brightest smile, offered cookies, and asked about the woman's children. The moment the neighbor left, Evelyn turned to me, her expression sharp as broken glass. "Why did you stand there like a fool?" she snapped. "Smile when people look at you." She slapped me hard across the face and said, "If you make me look bad again, you'll regret it." That night, she locked me in my room without dinner. I sat on the floor listening to the cicadas outside, promising myself that one day I would get away. The cruelty was not always physical. She had a way of turning small mistakes into humiliations. Once, when I forgot to take out the trash, she lined the kitchen chairs in a row and forced me to sit in front of them, calling it my jury. She pretended to question me like a defendant, while my younger half-brother laughed. After she declared me guilty of laziness, she made me kneel on the hard kitchen tiles for an hour while she cooked dinner. To her, it was a game. To me, it was a reminder that in this house I had no ally. School became my refuge, though even there, Evelyn found ways to interfere. She insisted on reading every assignment, circling words she thought were wrong, and accusing me of trying to sound smarter than I was. If I brought home an A, she would shrug and say, "Don't get arrogant, one grade doesn't make you special." My father accepted her version of events as truth. He believed that Evelyn kept me from becoming reckless. He did not see the bruises on my arms or the red marks on my knees, or maybe he chose not to see them. As I grew older, I began to dream of a way out. I would lie awake imagining the Naval Academy in Annapolis, picturing the stone buildings and the bay beyond them. I heard that if you made it through those gates, you belonged to something bigger than yourself, something stronger than the narrow walls of a toxic home. Evelyn must have sensed my hope because she worked harder to convince me it was impossible. She told me I was too weak, too undisciplined, too emotional. She laughed when I said I wanted to serve like my father. "You in uniform?" she sneered. "You wouldn't last a week." Her favorite weapon was comparison. She praised my half-brother for every small success, even when his report cards were half filled with C's. When I stayed up late studying, she called me obsessive. When I woke early to practice running before school, she accused me of showing off. Her constant message was that I was an intruder in my own house, a reminder of the wife my father had lost, and a rival she would never accept. But even as Evelyn tried to break me, I found resolve in the cracks of her cruelty. I taught myself to endure hunger when she withheld meals, to block out the sting of her words, to cling to the thought that there was a future beyond her reach. The more she tried to control me, the more I craved the discipline of the Navy, because at least their discipline meant service and purpose, not humiliation for amusement. I still remember the day I received my acceptance letter to the Naval Academy. It came in a large, white envelope with a blue crest, and when I tore it open, my hands shook. "Congratulations," it began. "You are appointed to the United States Naval Academy." My chest filled with light. I had done it. I had carved a path away from Evelyn's shadow. She stood in the doorway as I read the letter aloud, her arms folded. Instead of pride, she gave me a thin smile and said, "Don't think this makes you someone important. You'll fail like you always do." Her words stung, but behind them I felt a quiet victory. I was leaving Fayetteville, leaving the house that smelled of bleach and control, leaving the woman who had spent years trying to erase me. At 17, I packed my bags, kissed my mother's old photograph, and walked out the door. Evelyn's last words followed me down the steps. "Remember, Laura, family sees through you. Those officers won't protect you forever." Even now, sitting in that courtroom years later, I could hear her voice in my head. She had planted the seed of betrayal long before she took the stand against me. What shocked the jury as a mother's testimony against her daughter was for me only the culmination of a lifetime of poison. And yet, despite everything she had done, I was still standing still, wearing the uniform she swore I would never earn. Would you have survived a childhood like that where every mistake was punished and every success was twisted into shame? If you had lived under the rule of someone who smiled for the neighbors and struck you when no one watched, how would you have escaped? Tell me in the comments. The years at Annapolis were not easy, but compared to the constant fear of Evelyn's watchful eyes, they felt like freedom. I woke each morning to the sound of reveille instead of her sharp voice. I marched in formation alongside other plebes, and when an upperclassman shouted at me, it was never personal. It was training. It was tradition. It was part of belonging. For the first time in my life, the rules had purpose. When I collapsed into bed at night exhausted, I felt pride instead of shame. Still, Evelyn's presence clung to me. Letters arrived from home, written in her perfect cursive. Sometimes they were short and cutting. "You will never be as good as you think," or long lectures reminding me that no matter what uniform I wore, I was still under her judgment. I rarely responded, but I kept the letters folded in the bottom of my drawer, a reminder of what I was fighting against. During my second year, I returned home briefly for the holidays. Fayetteville looked the same, the streets lined with modest houses and the grocery store parking lot filled with pickup trucks. But when I walked through the front door, I felt as if I had entered enemy territory. Evelyn greeted me with her practiced smile, but the moment my father stepped away, she leaned in and whispered, "Don't think a year in Annapolis makes you different. You will always be the girl who embarrassed me in front of neighbors." Dinner that night was unbearable. Evelyn made a show of praising my half-brother's minor achievements while dismissing mine. When I tried to share a story about my training cruise, she cut me off. "Nobody wants to hear your bragging." The silence that followed was thick, my father poking at his plate, unwilling to confront her. I realized then that home would never be safe, not even for a moment. Back at the academy, I doubled my efforts. I wanted to prove to myself that I could rise beyond her predictions. I took extra watch rotations, volunteered for assignments others avoided, and graduated near the top of my class. When I received my commission as an officer, I held the certificate in both hands and remembered her sneer. "You wouldn't last a week. I had lasted 4 years." My first posting aboard the USS George Washington was a test of endurance and loyalty. Life at sea was cramped and grueling. The ship smelled of oil and salt, and every sound echoed in the steel corridors. I learned to sleep with the constant hum of engines beneath me and the crash of waves against the hull. My sailors respected me because I worked as hard as they did, sometimes harder. I sent letters home trying to bridge the gap with my father, but the few responses I received were laced with Evelyn's words. "Be careful. Laura pride comes before a fall." Despite the distance, she still found ways to pull me back into her grip. Once during a rare phone call, my father handed the receiver to her. She wasted no time. "Do you really think those medals will protect you forever? Remember, family knows who you really are." Her laughter echoed in my ear long after the call ended. When my father grew ill, I took emergency leave to be with him. In the hospital room, I sat beside his bed listening to the steady beep of the monitors. He looked frail, his once strong hands trembling as he reached for mine. "Thank you for coming," he whispered. Before I could answer, Evelyn entered, her voice sharp as ever. "Of course she came. She wants everyone to think she's the perfect daughter." My father said nothing. I realized then that even in sickness, he would not shield me from her venom. I paid the bills, arranged his medications, and sat through long nights at his bedside. Evelyn hovered, criticizing every decision, telling nurses that I was only here for appearances. When he recovered enough to return home, she dismissed me with a wave. "Go back to your ship. We can handle it without you." The words stung, but part of me was relieved to leave. Through each deployment and each sacrifice, I carried Evelyn's voice with me, not as guidance, but as a reminder of what I refused to become. Every order I gave every sailor I led, every long watch on the bridge, was proof that I had survived her control. Yet even with oceans between us, she never stopped. Letters still came. Rumors filtered through old neighbors that Evelyn told anyone who would listen that I thought I was better than the family, that one day the Navy would expose me. I brushed off the gossip, telling myself that my record spoke louder than her lies. But deep down, I feared she was planting seeds. Seeds that would one day grow into accusations no uniform could protect me from. And when I stood in that courtroom years later, listening to her steady voice condemning me as a traitor, I realized those seeds had finally borne their poisonous fruit. Do you see how far some people will go when envy and control become their weapons? Would you have endured years of whispers and slaps only to face the ultimate betrayal under oath? Comment below if you believe no one, not even family, should hold the power to break your name. When I first stepped onto the deck of the USS George Washington, the massive carrier loomed like a floating city, steel and salt, and the endless hum of machinery. I was 24, barely commissioned, my uniform stiff with newness, my heart thudding with the weight of responsibility. The smell of oil and the sting of sea air wrapped around me. I remember gripping the railing and telling myself that this was the beginning of the life I had fought for. Out here, Evelyn could not reach me. Out here, discipline meant survival, not humiliation. Days at sea blurred into cycles of watch rotations, drills, and the constant rhythm of operations. The carrier was alive with movement sailors rushing to stations, the clatter of tools in maintenance bays, the sharp calls of orders over intercoms. I learned to thrive in exhaustion, to balance paperwork with the unspoken duty of setting an example for the men and women under my command. They respected me because I worked as hard as they did. I learned their names, their fears, and their strengths. Some nights when the stars stretched endless above the dark water, I stood on the deck and felt a quiet pride that no words from Evelyn could erase. Still, I carried the weight of family. Every payday I sent half my salary home, believing it was my duty to help with my father's medical bills and my half-brother's education. When shipmates teased me for never buying myself luxuries, I shrugged it off. They didn't know that each dollar I sent away was an attempt to prove to my father that I was not the selfish child Evelyn painted me to be. I thought money could buy a sliver of respect. I was wrong. Evelyn told neighbors that I only sent money to control them, that my gifts came with strings. She poisoned even my sacrifices. During my first deployment to the Middle East, I felt the true cost of service. Long nights on watch, the horizon lit by distant flashes of conflict, the smell of diesel thick in the air. I wrote letters home, not knowing if they would be read or twisted. I signed everyone with love, though I often received nothing back. My sailors became my family. We ate together, we drilled together, we trusted each other when the sea grew angry. They called me tough but fair, and in their respect, I found a kind of healing. Then my father's health collapsed again. I received the Red Cross message while we were still overseas. Emergency leave granted, I flew back to Fayetteville and walked into a hospital room filled with the beeping of machines. My father looked frail, his hands trembling as he tried to grasp mine. Evelyn hovered at the bedside, sharp-eyed even in the harsh fluorescent light. She said, "You came back for applause, not for him." I wanted to scream, but instead I adjusted his blanket and ignored her. For weeks, I sat beside him managing medications, speaking with doctors, arranging bills. I used my savings to cover what the insurance would not. Evelyn dismissed my efforts with icy remarks. When neighbors visited, she painted herself as the tireless caretaker while I was just the showy officer passing through. It became clear that no amount of sacrifice would change her script. Still, I stayed until he was strong enough to return home. Back on the carrier, I poured my frustration into duty. I volunteered for night watches and extra training drills. I told myself that if my family could not recognize my worth, at least my sailors would. And they did. When one young seaman froze during a critical drill, I knelt beside him and spoke until his hands steadied. Afterward, he whispered, "Thank you, ma'am, you saved me." In that moment, I felt more like a daughter than I ever had at home. Yet even in the camaraderie of the Navy, Evelyn's shadow lingered. Rumors reached me through distant relatives. Evelyn told people I was arrogant, that my medals meant nothing, that someday the Navy would see through me. I brushed it aside, but deep down her words festered. They became a whisper that followed me across the seas. What if she was right? What if one day everything I built would be torn down not by enemies abroad, but by betrayal at home? Would you keep giving when every gift is twisted into poison? Would you keep serving when your own family mocks the uniform you wear? Tell me in the comments. My second deployment tested every part of me. The carrier was tasked with long operations in the Arabian Sea, and weeks bled into months under relentless sun. The flight deck roared with the thunder of aircraft. The salty wind stung my face and fatigue became a second skin. I learned to measure my life in watches' chow hall meals and the rare letters from home that carried more weight than they should. Each time I opened one, I hoped for a few kind words. Instead, Evelyn's handwriting cut me like glass. She wrote that people in Fayetteville wondered if I was really serving or just hiding overseas. She claimed my father said I cared more about rank than family. Whether he truly said those words or she invented them, they lodged in my chest all the same. Still, I kept sending money. Every wire transfer felt like another brick in the wall I was trying to build between her lies and my father's needs. I wanted him to live in comfort, to have the medicine he required to believe that at least one child had not abandoned him. But Evelyn told anyone who would listen that I was controlling, that my money was a leash. My half-brother repeated her accusations in text messages. You think cash makes you our savior. Stop pretending you care. Each word struck deeper than any exhaustion at sea. During one rare port call, I visited a chapel alone. I sat in silence, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling the air, and asked myself if service meant anything when my own family branded me selfish. Then I thought of the sailors who looked to me during drills, who followed my orders with trust. I remembered the seaman who had thanked me for calming his shaking hands. In them, I saw proof that my life mattered beyond Evelyn's reach. But the weight at home never lifted. My father's health wavered again, and once more, I was granted leave. In the hospital, I held his hand thinner, now veins blue against pale skin. He whispered, "I'm proud you came back." But before I could answer, Evelyn cut in. She told the nurse that I liked to play the hero, that I would vanish again the moment duty called. My father closed his eyes and said nothing. That silence hurt more than her words. I covered another round of bills. I stayed nights pacing the hospital corridors, the smell of disinfectant clinging to my uniform. I ignored Evelyn's commentary, telling myself that service demanded sacrifice not only overseas but here too. When he recovered and returned home, she thanked the neighbors for their prayers, but never once acknowledged what I had done. Back aboard the carrier, I tried to push past the ache. I focused on training cycles, on mentoring younger officers, on being the leader I had once needed as a child. When sailors stumbled, I caught them. When tempers flared, I diffused them. My crew became my chosen family. They called me steady, unshakable. If only they knew how every letter from home chipped away at that steadiness. I kept telling myself that loyalty to my country outweighed the poison at home. I convinced myself that service would silence her lies. But a small voice inside whispered that Evelyn's words had already taken root, that one day they would bloom into something I could not stop. Years later, when I stood accused in a courtroom and heard her call me a traitor, I realized that fear had always been prophecy. Would you keep standing tall in uniform if every sacrifice you made was twisted into evidence against you? Or would you finally break under the weight of family betrayal? Tell me in the comments. It began with a routine briefing in Norfolk, a room that smelled of coffee and ink from freshly printed reports. I had just returned from deployment when 2 officers from the Information Technology Division asked to speak with me privately. Their expressions were professional but carried a hint of unease. They slid a folder across the table. Inside were system logs showing unauthorized access to classified files at 3 in the morning. My credentials had been used. I felt the blood drain from my face. At that hour, I had been asleep in my quarters, my phone turned off, my laptop locked away. I explained this immediately, but one of the officers shook his head. The logs didn't lie. They had traced the activity to my account. My security clearance was suspended pending investigation. The word suspended cut like a blade. In the Navy, clearance is more than paperwork. It is trust, reputation, the invisible shield protecting your career. Without it, I was suddenly exposed. I walked out of that room with a weight heavier than any sea deployment. My sailors looked at me with questions in their eyes, questions I could not answer. The whisper spread quickly. Some avoided my gaze in the mess hall. Others stopped their conversations when I entered. It is remarkable how silence can be louder than accusation. At home in Fayetteville, the news traveled even faster. Evelyn wasted no time. She told neighbors that the Navy was investigating me, that she had always suspected something was wrong. She painted herself as a prophet finally proven right. When I called my father hoping for reassurance, Evelyn answered. Her voice carried triumph. "Didn't I always say your pride would be your downfall? The Navy is waking up to the truth." She hung up before I could respond. Days turned into weeks as the investigation dragged on. I reported to duty each morning but was barred from sensitive tasks. My colleagues treated me with polite caution, as if standing too close might taint their own records. Nights were worse. I lay in my quarters staring at the ceiling, hearing Evelyn's voice in my head. "Family sees through you. Those officers won't protect you forever." One evening, I attended a family dinner hoping to reconnect, to explain that the investigation was not proof of guilt. My half-brother smirked as I sat down. "So, spy games now?" He laughed, passing the mashed potatoes. Evelyn joined in telling him not to tease too hard because the Navy might already have me under surveillance. My father stayed silent, chewing slowly, eyes fixed on his plate. I looked around that table and realized I was already convicted in their minds. The humiliation grew sharper when I learned that someone had been feeding information to the investigators, whispering about my supposed arrogance, my supposed secret contacts. The source was not listed, but I had no doubt. Evelyn had been preparing for this moment for years, planting seeds of doubt in every ear willing to listen. What stunned me was how easily those seeds took root. I tried to cling to reason. System logs could be forged, accounts could be cloned, but the Navy believes in evidence, and the evidence wore my name. My defense counsel told me to stay calm, that truth had a way of surfacing. I wanted to believe him, yet a darker thought haunted me. What if the truth never mattered? What if my stepmother's narrative was stronger than any log or witness? Have you ever felt the walls closing in while the people who should defend you watched in silence? Would you trust the process, or would you already be preparing for betrayal? Tell me in the comments. The pressure built with each passing day. My clearance remained suspended, and every restriction felt like a public scarlet letter. When others entered secured spaces, I stayed behind. When classified discussions took place, my presence was no longer welcome. My name, once spoken with respect, was now attached to suspicion. Sailors who had once sought my advice kept their distance. The isolation gnawed at me more than fatigue ever had. Meanwhile, the investigators dug deeper. They traced the unauthorized access not only to my credentials, but also to physical times when I had supposedly been present. I protested showing duty logs that placed me elsewhere, but their brows furrowed with skepticism. It felt as if someone had studied my schedule, knew when I would be most vulnerable. That thought chilled me more than the accusation itself. Someone was working to erase me from within. Evelyn exploited every ripple. She spoke to old neighbors, telling them my arrogance had finally been exposed. She visited church gatherings, shaking her head as if in sorrow, while whispering that I had turned against my own country. Soon, distant relatives called with hesitant questions. "Is it true, Laura? Have you done something terrible?" Each call tightened the knot around my chest. It was Evelyn's stage, and she played her role perfectly. The final blow came when an anonymous letter was delivered to my command, claiming to be from someone who had overheard me speaking critically of the Navy during a family gathering. I knew instantly whose hand had guided that letter. Only Evelyn would twist private words into betrayal. She had always kept a mental ledger of every time I disagreed with her, and now she weaponized it. I met with my defense counsel, a calm JAG officer with years etched in the lines around his eyes. He told me that an Article 32 hearing would determine if there was enough evidence to move forward with a court-martial. He urged me to remain steady, to trust the system. But in the silence of my quarters, I wondered if the system could be trusted when lies came from blood. I remembered Evelyn's cruel jury game from my childhood when she had lined up chairs and forced me to kneel under her mock trial. Now the game was real, and the jury was not made of kitchen chairs, but of officers with the power to destroy my career. She had prepared me for this moment without me realizing it, conditioning me to expect judgment without justice. The night before the hearing, I stood by the window looking out at the quiet base, the street lamps casting halos on the pavement. I thought of all the years I had given the deployments, the missed birthdays, the bills paid for a father who rarely thanked me. I thought of Evelyn's smile as she whispered poison into the ears of anyone who would listen. And I knew then that the hearing would not just be about evidence. It would be about whether my entire life of service could withstand a single family's betrayal. If your own stepmother built a case against you brick by brick, would you believe that truth alone could save you? Or would you brace yourself for a fight that could cost everything? Tell me in the comments. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to uniforms after decades of hearings. When the bailiff called the room to order with a booming "all rise," everyone stood, and I felt my knees lock in practiced reflex. The military judge, a colonel in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, entered with calm dignity. I snapped to attention, saluted, and responded to his greeting with a steady, "Yes, Your Honor." My voice sounded firm, but inside my chest, everything rattled. This was no longer rumor or investigation. This was the beginning of my trial. A general court-martial convened to decide whether I, Lieutenant Commander Laura Jennings, would be condemned as a traitor. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed major in dress blues, laid out the charges in a voice that never faltered. Unauthorized disclosure of classified material, espionage, treason. Each word struck harder than the last. I had studied enough military law to know what those charges carried: decades in confinement, loss of rank. Dishonor, my career erased as if it had never been. Across the room, the panel of 7 officers sat like statues. Their ranks gleamed: commanders, captains, men and women who had worn the uniform longer than I had been alive. They were my jury, sworn to weigh the evidence and vote in secret. 2/3 would be enough to convict me. They wrote on yellow pads, their pens scratching softly, but not a flicker of sympathy crossed their faces. Then came the voice I dreaded. Evelyn, my stepmother, was called as the first witness. She walked to the stand with the same polished poise she used to greet neighbors in Fayetteville. She swore the oath with a calm hand and sat down as if she belonged more in that courtroom than I did. The prosecutor asked her to describe my character. Evelyn folded her hands neatly in her lap and began her performance. She spoke of a girl who had always defied authority, who mocked discipline, who longed for attention. She said I had spoken against the Navy at the dinner table, that I had once joked about how easy it would be to use my access to make money. None of it was true, but she told it with such conviction that I saw 2 panel members glance at each other. My throat burned as I fought the urge to shout. Evelyn even produced old letters I had written home during deployment letters, where I had confessed exhaustion and fear. She read those words aloud as proof of my weakness, twisting them into evidence of disloyalty. I wanted to tear those letters from her hands. I had written them at sea under dim red lights, pouring out my heart to a father who rarely responded. Now Evelyn brandished them like weapons, stripping away the last private corner of my soul. My defense counsel objected, but the judge allowed the excerpts as character evidence. Evelyn's lips curled in victory. As she stepped down from the witness stand, she caught my eye and smiled faintly, the same smile she had given me years ago after forcing me to kneel on the kitchen tiles in front of her mock jury. I realized then that she had been rehearsing for this moment all her life, and now she had an audience that mattered. The prosecution followed with technical experts. An officer from IT explained the logs pointing to timestamps that matched my account credentials. He spoke in precise terms about IP addresses and system trails. I knew enough about networks to see the gaps to suspect cloning, but to the panel, his testimony sounded like mathematics: clean, absolute, undeniable. I stole glances at the jury. Some leaned forward, brows knit. Others wrote more notes. Every line on their pads felt like a nail in my coffin. When it was my turn to testify, my defense counsel stood beside me, his voice steady. He asked me simple questions first: my name, my years of service, my record. Then came the deeper ones. Did you ever access classified material without authorization? No, sir. Did you ever disclose information to anyone outside proper channels? No, sir. Did you ever betray your oath to the Navy? I raised my chin, looked each juror in the eye, and said, never. But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of Evelyn's testimony pressing against me. She had been family. She had stood under oath. And though every word was poison, it dripped with the authority of intimacy. The prosecutor pressed me harder. Why did the logs show your name? Why had neighbors in Fayetteville heard you speak critically of the Navy? Why had your own stepmother testified against you? Each question carved deeper. My answers sounded true to me, but did they sound true to the panel? When the day ended, the judge called a recess. The bailiff announced, "All rise again," and I stood rigid as the judge departed. My legs ached, but my heart ached more. I caught a glimpse of Evelyn leaving the courtroom, her arm hooked through my father's. He didn't look back at me. I wanted to believe his silence meant conflict, but in my gut, I knew it meant surrender. That night, I sat alone in my quarters on base, staring at the reflection of my own uniform in the window. The same uniform I had polished for inspections, the same one I had bled and sweated in across oceans. Now it looked like a costume, and I wondered if tomorrow it would be stripped away. I had faced storms at sea, but nothing compared to this storm of betrayal within my own blood. Would you hold your head high in a courtroom when your own family swore under oath that you were guilty? Or would you crumble under the weight of lies? Tell me in the comments. The second day of trial dawned gray, the kind of morning when the Virginia air felt heavy with salt and rain. I pressed my uniform into sharp lines, though my hands trembled slightly as I pinned my insignia. The courtroom filled quickly. The bailiff's command, "All rise," rang out again, and we all stood as the judge entered his presence as steady as the flag hanging behind him. I saluted, answered, "Yes, Your Honor," and sat only when ordered. The prosecution wasted no time. They called a neighbor from Fayetteville, a man I remembered vaguely from church picnics. He testified that Evelyn had once confided her fears to him, that I had spoken recklessly about how my position gave me access to secrets. His words were laced with hesitation, but they spilled into the courtroom nonetheless. My defense counsel cross-examined, asking if he had ever heard those words directly from me. The man admitted no, only from Evelyn. Yet the damage was done. A shadow had been painted, and shadows are hard to erase. Next came an officer from the security division. He held up documents showing that my badge had been scanned near a secure facility during one of the alleged breaches. I knew exactly when that was. I had walked past the building on my way to another duty station, my badge in my pocket. Someone had cloned the scan. I tried to explain, but the prosecutor framed my defense as convenient memory. The panel listened with guarded eyes. They scribbled notes. My defense counsel stood tall and pushed back. He brought forward my commanding officer from the USS George Washington, who testified that my service had been exemplary, my conduct impeccable. He spoke of my leadership of nights when I had calmed frightened sailors, of missions I had executed flawlessly. His words carried weight, but I could sense the panel wrestling between two portraits of me, the dedicated officer and the supposed traitor. The judge recessed for lunch, and as I stood to leave, I saw Evelyn again. She lingered by the aisle, speaking quietly to others, her hands folded like a saint's. When our eyes met, she gave me the same thin smile she had worn when she read my letters aloud, twisting my exhaustion into disloyalty. That smile followed me out of the courtroom like a brand. After the break, the prosecution pressed harder. They replayed excerpts from Evelyn's testimony, her voice clear, unwavering, damning. They layered it with the technical data, weaving a net of circumstantial evidence. My defense counsel objected, arguing that the case rested on interpretation, not proof. The judge allowed the panel to consider it all. As the hours dragged, I felt the air grow staler, the walls closer. Each time the bailiff barked, "All rise," I wondered if it would be the last time I stood in uniform before it was stripped from me. I remembered nights on deployment stars glittering above endless waves when I had felt proud and strong. Now in this courtroom, I felt reduced to ink on paper and whispers from a woman who had never wanted me. When the session ended, the judge instructed the panel to review the evidence overnight. Their faces betrayed nothing as they filed out, leaving me alone with the echo of the gavel. My defense counsel placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, telling me that trials were marathons, not sprints. But I knew marathons required endurance, and mine was wearing thin. That night, I barely slept. I replayed every word Evelyn had spoken, every sideways glance from the jury, every question the prosecutor had asked. I thought of my father sitting silently beside her, offering no defense. I thought of my half-brother smirking over dinner, calling me a spy. I realized that I was not only fighting the prosecution, I was fighting the narrative my family had been building for years. In the stillness of the barracks, I whispered to myself the oath I had sworn at Annapolis: to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I never imagined that the domestic enemy would wear the face of my stepmother. If you were on trial with evidence stacked against you and the voices of your own family sealing the cracks, would you still believe truth could win? Or would you brace yourself for the gavel that could erase everything you had built? Comment below. The third morning of trial carried an eerie stillness, as if the entire base held its breath. I straightened my uniform, the fabric stiff against my skin, and entered the courtroom with the weight of inevitability pressing on my shoulders. The bailiff called us to rise once more, and the judge entered, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his cap. I saluted, answered, "Yes, Your Honor," and took my seat, feeling every eye in the room upon me. The prosecution prepared to deliver what they clearly hoped would be the final blow. They stacked folders high, each filled with data that supposedly linked me to espionage. Evelyn sat primly in the gallery, her posture perfect, her lips pursed like a woman waiting for victory. My father sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. The room buzzed with anticipation, every shift of paper and cough magnified in the silence. Then, without warning, the bailiff strode to the center and barked, "Attention in the court." The doors opened, and in stepped a man in full uniform bearing the insignia of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. His presence cut through the room like a blade. In his hand, he carried a sealed envelope in a small black case. The judge looked up sharply. "Identify yourself. Colonel James Whitaker, Special Investigator, appearing under direct authorization of the Pentagon," the man declared. A hush rippled through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor faltered her hand, hovering over her files. The judge motioned him forward, and Colonel Whitaker placed the case on the bench, saluting crisply before handing over his orders. "These materials have just been declassified for this proceeding," Whitaker explained. "They are directly relevant to the charges against Lieutenant Jennings." The judge conferred briefly with the defense and prosecution, then nodded for the bailiff to set up the monitor. The panel of officers leaned forward, their notebooks poised. When the screen flickered to life, my breath caught. The footage showed the hallway outside a secure facility at Fort Bragg, the date stamp matching one of the alleged breaches. For several minutes, nothing unusual appeared, just routine comings and goings of authorized personnel. Then a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Commander Daniel Brooks, an officer I had once worked alongside. He approached my workstation with calm precision, inserted a USB device, and began transferring files. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Whitaker raised a hand for silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the actual perpetrator of the breach." He used cloned credentials belonging to Lieutenant Jennings to mask his activity. My heart hammered in my chest. For weeks, I had lived beneath the crushing weight of false accusation, and now finally the truth glimmered before me. The footage continued. Brooks glanced around, clearly ensuring no witnesses were nearby. His movements were deliberate, practiced the work of someone deeply familiar with security systems. He finished, removed the device, and slipped away. The timestamp aligned perfectly with one of the supposed times I had been accused of unauthorized access. The prosecutor rose, her voice thin. "Your Honor, this evidence has not been vetted through discovery," but the judge cut her off. "Major, sit down. This is admissible." The panel scribbled furiously, heads bent together as if struggling to keep pace with the revelation. Then Whitaker signaled again, and another file loaded on screen. This time it was audio. My stomach lurched as Evelyn's voice filled the room, low but unmistakable. "She will take the fall. No one will doubt it. She's too stubborn to confess, which makes her look guilty." A second voice, my half-brother Mark, replied, "And we'll have what we need. Brooks promised everything would be clean. She'll never see it coming." Gasps tore through the courtroom. I felt my throat tighten, tears pressing at the corners of my eyes. The very people who had sworn to stand by me had plotted my destruction. The panelists looked up now, not at the evidence, but at Evelyn in the gallery. She shifted uncomfortably, but her chin remained raised. For the first time since the trial began, I felt the air shift. The prosecution's case no longer seemed unshakable. The truth was breaking through the lies. If you sat in that courtroom watching video and hearing voices of your own family conspiring against you, what would you feel first, relief that the truth was out, or rage that those closest had tried to end you? Comment your answer. The silence after the audio ended was heavier than any gavel strike. I stared at the monitor, frozen between vindication and devastation. The words of my stepmother and half-brother echoed in my skull like a drumbeat, each syllable stripping away the last remnants of family loyalty I had once clung to. Evelyn sat stiff in the gallery, her lips pressed into a pale line, while Mark avoided all eyes, his hands clenched in his lap. For years, they had mocked me, doubted me, whispered poison into every conversation. Now their treachery was undeniable. The judge cleared his throat. "Colonel Whitaker, please clarify the source of this recording." The investigator stood firm. "Your Honor, this was recovered yesterday morning under warrant with full Pentagon authorization. It confirms the conspiracy to frame Lieutenant Jennings. The voices are identified as Evelyn Jennings and her son, Mark Jennings. Additional evidence corroborates their financial ties to Commander Brooks." A murmur spread across the courtroom like a rising tide. Panel officers leaned toward one another, their pens scribbling with renewed urgency. The prosecutor sat rigid, her face pale, her carefully woven case unraveling in public view. My defense counsel leaned close and whispered, "Laura, this changes everything. Stay steady." The judge signaled for the video to resume. On screen, Brooks's voice joined the recording. "I've got her credentials fully mapped. Once the files are transferred, the trail will lead straight to her. She won't stand a chance." Evelyn's reply sent a shiver through the gallery. "Good. She's always believed she's better than us. Let her see how it feels to be brought low." That was the final fracture. Gasps rose from behind me. Journalists scribbling furiously, military observers shaking their heads. One of the panel officers lifted his eyes from the notes and looked straight at me. His gaze was no longer guarded suspicion, it was recognition. For the first time, someone on that panel seemed to see me not as a suspect, but as a soldier betrayed. The judge raised his gavel. "This court will recess for 30 minutes. The bailiff barked the command and we all rose. My legs felt weak beneath me, but I held my posture. As we filed out, Evelyn's eyes met mine. No smug smile this time, only the flicker of fear beneath her carefully painted mask. In the corridor, reporters surged forward, but the bailiff pushed them back. My counsel and I stood in silence until Colonel Whitaker approached. "Lieutenant Jennings, you should know Brooks has confessed. He's already in custody. He confirmed your stepmother and half-brother provided him with your duty schedules, access habits, and personal information." I blinked hard, absorbing the words. Confession, custody, proof. After months of whispers and humiliation, the truth was no longer buried. When the session reconvened, the panel returned with fresh eyes. The prosecutor rose, but her voice faltered. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the government requests time to review." The judge shook his head. "Major, you will have time, but the panel has seen enough to question the integrity of your case." My defense counsel stood. "Your Honor, we move to dismiss all charges against Lieutenant Jennings on grounds of exonerating evidence." The judge nodded slowly. "Motion noted. Panel will deliberate." The bailiff led the officers to their chamber. Behind closed doors, they would cast secret ballots, each slip of paper carrying the weight of my future. Military law required 2/3 to convict. But this time, I knew the tide had shifted. The betrayal that once buried me was now the very proof of my innocence. As I sat waiting, my hands folded on the defense table, I realized I wasn't just waiting for a verdict. I was waiting for the first crack in Evelyn's mask to widen into collapse. I was waiting for justice to peel back every lie she had spun. If your entire life had hung by a thread, and then in one moment you heard your betrayers condemn themselves in their own voices, would you feel triumph or emptiness? Share your thoughts. When the panel returned from deliberation, the courtroom stood in complete silence. The bailiff's voice rang out once again. "All rise," we obeyed, boots and shoes scraping against the floor in unison. The judge's face was calm but stern as he motioned for us to sit. Every eye turned toward the jury of officers. They held folded slips of paper, the quiet crinkle of ballots filling the air. One by one, they handed them to the bailiff, who delivered the stack to the judge. He scanned them quickly, his lips pressed together, then set them aside. "The panel has reached consensus," he announced. "But before I read, the government has a motion." The prosecutor stood, her voice strangely soft. "Your Honor, in light of the new evidence, the government withdraws all charges against Lieutenant Jennings." She swallowed hard, glancing at me once before looking away. "We regret the time and resources expended on a case that now appears fraudulent." The words cut through the courtroom like a blade. For weeks, I had carried the weight of treason only to have it lifted in a single breath. Gasps erupted behind me. Journalists scribbled frantically, cameras clicked, and whispers hissed through the rows. The judge struck his gavel. Order. When the room settled, he turned to me. "Lieutenant Jennings, you are free to go. The record will reflect your exoneration. You will receive full reinstatement of pay and privileges. This court extends its apologies for the ordeal you have endured." I wanted to feel relief triumph even, but my gaze slid toward Evelyn. She sat frozen, her face drained of color. Mark shifted uneasily beside her. The bailiff stepped forward. "Mrs. Evelyn Jennings," he barked, "you are under arrest for perjury and conspiracy to commit espionage." The clank of handcuffs echoed as 2 MPs hauled her to her feet. Evelyn didn't fight. She didn't cry. She simply straightened her back, the mask of control slipping only in the twitch of her jaw. The sight sent a wave of conflicting emotions through me. For years, I had dreamed of her downfall, imagined what it might feel like to see her stripped of power. And now, here it was real, undeniable. Yet beneath the vindication lay something else grief for the years stolen, the innocence buried under her cruelty. Mark leapt to his feet, his voice breaking. "This isn't right. She did it for us, for the family." His outburst drew stares from every corner of the room. Colonel Whitaker stepped forward calmly. "You'll have your chance to explain, Mr. Jennings. For now, you're coming with us." 2 more MPs flanked him, guiding him toward the door. He shouted once more, his eyes burning into mine. "You ruined everything," I didn't reply. What words could there be? He had chosen betrayal, and now he faced its cost. My father remained seated, his shoulders sagging. He neither spoke nor looked at me. For the first time, I saw him not as a figure of authority, not even as a parent, but as a broken man, unwilling to challenge the lies that had consumed his household. His silence had been his choice, and silence had consequences. As Evelyn and Mark were led away, the gallery buzzed louder. Some spectators shook their heads in disgust. Others whispered about betrayal and shame. The judge dismissed the panel, thanking them for their service. The officers filed out, some glancing at me with respectful nods. For them, the trial was over. For me, it was only the beginning of reckoning with what had been revealed. When I finally stepped out into the corridor, flashes from cameras blinded me. Questions were shouted. "Lieutenant, how do you feel? What happens to your family now?" I kept walking, my defense counsel shielding me with his presence. Every step felt heavy, each echo a reminder that my name was free, but my family was shattered. If justice meant the truth was finally out, could it also mean peace? Or does the exposure of betrayal simply deepen the wounds? Tell me, what do you think? The days that followed moved with brutal speed. Evelyn was booked at the Norfolk Brig, her mugshot splashed across military papers that once praised my service. Headlines read, "Stepfamily Conspiracy Exposed, Lieutenant Jennings Cleared." I watched them from my quarters, each headline striking like lightning. Mark was processed too, though his charges were lighter: conspiracy and obstruction. Still, the shame was permanent. He had been stripped of the scholarships I once helped him secure, the future I sacrificed, for collapsing into dust. The community in Fayetteville responded swiftly. Neighbors who once chuckled at Evelyn's gossip now crossed the street when her name was spoken. The church she paraded in front of turned its back, whispering that no woman who plotted against her own stepdaughter could sit in the same pews. What had been a mask of respectability was now nothing but ashes. My father faced his own reckoning. Though he was not arrested, the military benefits he had depended on were suspended pending review. He was questioned repeatedly about what he knew about the silence he chose while Evelyn whispered poison into every ear. I visited him once, standing on the porch of the house that had never been a home. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. "I didn't know it would go this far," he said. I stared at him, feeling nothing but the weight of years wasted. "You didn't stop it either," I answered before turning away. At work, I was restored to duty, my clearance reinstated. Yet whispers followed me still. Soldiers are slow to forget scandal. I carried myself with discipline, but inside I was hollowed by betrayal. The Navy gave me back my uniform, but no institution could give back the trust I had lost. Meanwhile, Evelyn's trial moved quickly. Military prosecutors charged her with perjury, conspiracy, and aiding espionage. In court, she maintained her composure, speaking in the same calm, condescending tone she had used on me since childhood. But the recordings were undeniable, her own voice plotting my destruction. When the sentence came, 20 years, her mask cracked at last. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, a fear deeper than any she had once tried to instill in me. Mark pled guilty, taking a reduced sentence, but his anger remained unrepentant. He told the press I had abandoned the family, that I had brought it all on myself. His words were bitter, desperate, the cries of a man drowning in consequences of his own making. No one believed him anymore. In the aftermath, I drove once more through Fayetteville. The streets I had biked as a girl seemed smaller, emptier. I parked outside the family house. The paint was peeling, the windows clouded. Evelyn's roses, once meticulously pruned, had withered. I stood at the curb, staring. For years, this house had been the center of my torment. Now, it was nothing but a shell. I didn't walk closer. I didn't need to. I turned the key in my ignition and drove away, leaving it to rot behind me. The Navy reassigned me to Pentagon duty this time in cybersecurity reform. The irony was sharp. I once accused of betrayal, now tasked with strengthening the very systems that had been exploited against me. Yet I accepted. Purpose could be rebuilt, even if family could not. Late at night, when silence filled my apartment, I asked myself if justice had been enough. Evelyn was gone. Mark disgraced my father, reduced to shadows of what he once claimed to be. But scars do not vanish with verdicts. They linger, reminders of battles fought not against enemies abroad, but against the people who should have been allies at home. If your family tore you down piece by piece until the world believed their lies, would you ever forgive them once truth returned? Or would forgiveness feel like betrayal of yourself? I want to hear your answer. The months after the trial unfolded like a battlefield littered with ruins. My name had been cleared, my record restored, yet the damage to my soul felt immeasurable. I returned to duty, walking the halls of the Pentagon in full uniform, but every salute carried a shadow of what had nearly been lost. Some colleagues nodded with respect, others with wary distance. Scandal lingers long after verdicts. Evelyn's sentence sent shockwaves through Fayetteville. She was stripped not only of her freedom, but of her carefully curated identity. The woman who once lorded over church socials and neighborhood gatherings was now a convict. Mark branded a conspirator, tried to rebuild, but doors slammed in his face. No school, no employer wanted his name attached to theirs. My father lived in the quiet collapse of his silence. His pension reduced his dignity. Gone. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. Victory in court did not heal the child forced to kneel on cold floors, nor the officer branded traitor by her own blood. At night, I would wake in a sweat hearing Evelyn's voice echoing, "She'll never see it coming." Some mornings I stared at my reflection and wondered who I had become. An officer, yes, but also a survivor stitched together with scars invisible to the eye. To heal, I turned toward service. Assigned to cybersecurity reform, I poured myself into the work. Every system I reviewed, every policy I tightened felt like one more barrier against conspiracies, like the one that nearly destroyed me. My superiors praised my dedication, but what they saw as discipline was survival. I was building armor from data and policy, protecting others from facing what I had endured. Outside of work, I kept my world small. My apartment was bare, no family photographs, no reminders of Fayetteville, only a desk, a bed, and a shelf of military history books. I cooked simple meals, ran at dawn, wrote reports late into the night. Slowly, I carved out a rhythm not of joy, but of stability. And yet, cracks appeared. At ceremonies, I stood among fellow officers and watched them with their families, wives, husbands, children, waving from the crowd. Their cheers felt like a world closed to me. I wondered if they knew how fragile family ties could be, how swiftly trust could rot from within. One evening, after a long day in the office, I received a message from an old academy friend, Claire. She had followed my case quietly, unable to risk public support, but now she reached out. We met for coffee in D.C., and for the first time in months, I let my guard slip. She listened not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. "Laura," she said softly, "you can't carry betrayal alone forever. You have to build something new, even if it's small." Her words stayed with me. I began to open the door cautiously to new connections. A small circle of colleagues became confidants. I volunteered at a veterans center, helping younger service members navigate the maze of family expectations and military duty. Each story I heard reminded me I was not the only one scarred by those who should have protected us. The turning point came when I was invited to speak at a leadership forum. Standing before a room of officers, I told my story, not the classified details, but the personal truth. I spoke of betrayal, of false charges, of standing in court as my own family sought my ruin. The silence in the room was profound. When I finished, the applause rose not with pity, but with solidarity. I realized then that my pain could serve others, that my scars could become warnings, my endurance, a map. If life shattered you in the hands of those closest, would you use the shards to cut deeper or to build something that could not be broken again? Tell me in the comments. From that forum forward, my life took on a different shape. No longer was I just the officer who had been accused and acquitted. I became something more, a voice that others sought out when whispers of doubt or betrayal crept into their own homes. Sailors wrote me letters about manipulative parents. Officers spoke quietly of brothers or spouses who had used loyalty as a leash. Each story carved deeper into me, but instead of reopening wounds, it confirmed I was not alone. My role at the Pentagon expanded. I was asked to draft new protocols to safeguard service members against family exploitation. It was a bitter irony that the nightmare Evelyn orchestrated became the blueprint for reform. But I accepted because nothing soothed my scars more than knowing someone else might be spared. I spent nights in offices lit only by desk lamps drafting language about clearance reviews, reporting mechanisms, and protective oversight. Each line of text felt like a shield forged from my suffering. Meanwhile, Evelyn's absence grew into a strange silence. There were no more letters, no phone calls, no presence at all. It was as though she had evaporated into her sentence, leaving only wreckage behind. Mark tried writing to me from his reduced sentence program, blaming me for destroying the family. I tore up his letters unread. My father remained in Fayetteville, a ghost of the man who once wore a uniform with pride. His silence toward me was complete, and I matched it. Yet I was not entirely alone. Claire stayed in touch, nudging me into dinners, reminding me that family could be chosen. Over time, others joined that circle. A small, steadfast community formed around me, fellow officers, veterans, friends who knew that trust must be proven, not presumed. Their presence was steady, not dramatic, and slowly I began to breathe without the constant weight of betrayal on my chest. Years later, during a promotion ceremony in Washington, I stood again in uniform, the flag behind me, my name called with honor rather than suspicion. As the pin was fastened to my shoulder, I thought of the courtroom where Evelyn had declared me a traitor. I thought of the panel's stern faces, the clank of handcuffs, the cold echo of her words. And then I thought of now the applause of colleagues, the salute of my peers, the clear, steady voice of the presiding officer declaring me fit for higher command. Justice had come, but justice alone had not rebuilt me. What rebuilt me were the choices I made after the decision to stand, to serve, to forge bonds where blood ties had failed. Later that evening, driving past the quiet Arlington streets, I realized something. I had not only survived Evelyn's destruction, I had built from it. The ashes of betrayal had become the soil of resilience. And those scars never vanish, they had hardened into reminders that I was stronger than the lies designed to erase me. If you had been broken by the very people meant to protect you, would you let that define you forever? Or would you rise building a new life from the ruins? I want to hear your answer. The years that followed were not marked by sudden triumphs, but by slow, steady healing. My path to resurrection did not come wrapped in medals or ceremonies alone. It emerged in quiet mornings, in the steadiness of routine, in choosing to live without chains to a past that once defined me. The Pentagon offered me choice assignments, a rapid track back into leadership, and yet what mattered most was not the work I did on paper, but the work I did on myself. I learned to sit in silence without hearing Evelyn's voice in every echo. I learned to walk into a room without wondering who might believe I was guilty. I learned to accept that scars do not disappear, they teach. At first, I carried them as burdens, heavy reminders of betrayal. But over time, I came to see them as proof of endurance. The Navy had restored my record, but life had taught me a lesson far deeper than clearance or commendation. Trust must be earned. Loyalty must be proven. And sometimes family is not the one you are born into, but the one you forge through fire. I began mentoring younger officers, not in formal classrooms, but in one-on-one talks where honesty mattered more than regulation. One afternoon, a young lieutenant asked me quietly if it was true that my family had testified against me. The question stung, but I answered with calm. Yes, I told her, and it almost destroyed me. But it didn't, because betrayal doesn't have to be the end of your story. Her eyes widened, and I saw in her the same fear I once carried, the fear of losing not just career, but identity if family loyalty collapsed. In sharing my scars, I gave her hope. Those conversations multiplied. Each time I spoke, I felt another piece of myself steady. I had once been silenced by shame, crushed by the thought that people might believe Evelyn's lies. Now I spoke openly because the truth had power greater than any whisper. My life became not just about serving the Navy, but about serving those who might one day walk through fire as I had. Outside of the Pentagon, I found purpose in unexpected places. At veterans centers, I met men and women who had faced battles far from the battlefield, domestic violence, broken families, manipulative relatives who tried to profit from their service. Their stories echoed mine, and in each story I heard, I saw an opportunity to say, "You are not alone." I could not erase their scars, but I could stand as proof that survival was possible. One autumn, standing before a group of veterans in Fayetteville, I told my story for the first time in the town that had birthed both my pain and my escape. The room was silent as I spoke of kneeling on cold floors under Evelyn's orders of sitting in court as she painted me a traitor of walking free as her mask crumbled. When I finished, there was no applause, only a quiet nodding, the kind of response that meant they understood in their bones. For the first time, I felt not like a survivor alone, but like part of a community stitched together by resilience. At home, my walls remained bare of family photos, but they were no longer empty. Instead, they held mementos of the family I had chosen, a group photo of my Pentagon team, a framed letter from a sailor thanking me for guidance, a medal presented not for combat, but for integrity and leadership. These were the symbols of my rebirth, my resurrection from the ashes Evelyn had scattered. Still, I never confused healing with forgetting. Some nights I dreamed of the courtroom, the bailiff's command, the gavel's strike. I woke with my heart racing, reminded that scars whisper even when they no longer bleed. But those whispers no longer ruled me. They were reminders that I had survived, not warnings that I would fall again. At my promotion to commander, I stood in front of my peers, the flag behind me, the oath on my lips. As the words flowed to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, I felt no bitterness, only clarity. I had lived the meaning of those words not just in combat or on deck, but in facing enemies within my own family, and I had prevailed. Resurrection, I realized, was not about erasing the past. It was about claiming the future. I had once believed my worth depended on Evelyn's approval, my father's pride, my family's acceptance. Now I knew better. My worth was mine alone, forged in service, proven in resilience, sealed in survival. If you had lived through betrayal so deep it shattered your foundation, what would resurrection mean to you? Would it be forgiveness, or would it be freedom? Tell me in the comments. The final piece of my journey came not in a courtroom or on a ship, but in a quiet office at the Pentagon. A young officer newly assigned to my division came in trembling one day. She confessed that her brother had been asking unusual questions about her work, questions that went beyond curiosity. I recognized the pattern instantly. I looked her in the eyes and said, "I believe you." She burst into tears. No one had ever told me that when I sounded the alarm years ago. Together, we reported the situation, and within weeks, an investigation confirmed an attempted manipulation. This time, it was stopped before it could bloom into destruction. For her, it meant safety. For me, it meant closure. My pain had not been wasted. It had become protection for another. That night, I walked past the National Mall, the monuments glowing against the dark sky. I thought of Evelyn locked away, of Mark bitter and broken, of my father living in silence. I thought of myself walking free, not untouched, but undefeated. My story had been twisted by lies then, untwisted by truth, but it had not ended there. It had been rewritten by resilience. I began to write my experiences down not as a memoir for profit, but as a guide for those who would come after me. Each page carried lessons on boundaries, on loyalty, on recognizing when family becomes a battlefield. I wrote not to relive my pain, but to ensure others could navigate theirs. At my desk one evening, I read back a line I had written. Justice doesn't erase betrayal, but it teaches you who your real family is. That was the message I wanted the world to remember. Not that I had been accused or that I had been vindicated, but that I had chosen life beyond betrayal. When I finally stood at my next promotion ceremony, now as captain, I felt the full weight of that truth. My ship, my crew, my colleagues, this was my family. Not bound by blood, but by trust proven under fire. As the applause rang out, I lifted my chin and thought of every moment Evelyn tried to erase me. Each attempt had only made me stronger. For the audience listening now, I say, this betrayal may scar you, but it does not define you. Resurrection is possible not because the past disappears, but because you decide to rise above it. If you have ever faced betrayal, I ask you this: did it break you or did it teach you to rise? Share your answer. Someone else reading it may need your story to find their strength.